Well, here's one that may have a few little surprises. I got some war stories. I got some stuff to talk about catalytic converters. A lot of people aren't interested in that. I knew one guy back in 1986. It was one of the shop foremen at the dealership where I worked, and almost immediately, as soon as he bought his brand spanking new Ford truck, he had the total exhaust system ripped off of it and put, thrush mufflers and straight pipes going out the back. And they kind of makes you sick when you see somebody make a modification like that on a brand new vehicle. Of course, in Alabama here we don't have emission, inspections and that kind of stuff, but that doesn't matter. It's just really a bad idea to chop one up like that. I could talk about that for a while, but this is about the kind of catalytic converter that you're seeing here, not this kind of cat. And so that's what you might call a warm-up cat there. He's doing a warm-up before he does his workout. Well, cat's basically a catalyst to begin with in chemical terms. It speeds up a chemical reaction, and it's not consumed or permanently altered in the process of doing that job. When we hear the word catalyst, you might hear somebody talk about a catalyst for change and this kind of thing, and this would be somebody that changes other people without undergoing changes themselves in the process or whatever. But combustion byproducts go in to be processed, which would be your hydrocarbons, your carbon monoxide, and your oxides of nitrogen. Those are the problematic gases. And then CO2, nitrogen, water vapor, and oxygen leave the pipe on the going out the back. Of course, you got these oxygen sensors here before and after this front cat. This one is not monitored for efficiency, but this one is. Alright, so the light off cat, that's the one that's monitored, is mounted close to the engine. On a lot of your little four-cylinder cars, it's crammed right up in there as part of the exhaust manifold. The oxidation catalyst is farther downstream, and it's not monitored by any kind of an O2 sensor or any algorithm there. And it handles the HC and CO and converts them to CO2. Now your oxides of nitrogen is basically where it takes the oxygen and the nitrogen that were locked together during the high heat of combustion, and it breaks them apart into the oxygen and nitrogen molecules that are separate from one another instead of being locked together. And it could be, the reason they say NO with a little x is it could be any number. It could be NO2, NO3, NO4, this kind of thing, or just NO. So it's a whole bunch of compounds. It's not all like nitrous oxide like you're thinking about with your NOx tank that's in the trunk on your Mustang. The oxidation catalyst is, if it's a three-way catalyst, and on your sticker it'll say TWC, three-way catalyst means it's taking care of all three of these gases here. Alright, so CO2 versus water vapor. The most significant greenhouse gas, even according to the government panel, is water vapor. And this is how much of the water vapor, 99.999% of water vapor is naturally occurring. That's clouds, not to mention these underwater volcanic eruptions like that Tonga thing that happened, a couple of years ago. And it put, like tons and tons and tons and billions of gallons of water into the air. And I would be so bold as to say that all of this heavy rain they had in Texas had something to do with that. It was so much water in the air that whenever it came down, it circles the planet and then it comes down when the conditions are right. I don't know that. I hadn't heard anybody else say that. I may be totally wrong, but the long and the short of it is the more water there is up there, the more that's going to come down. And they had a dreadful flood in Texas earlier this year that I feel like probably had something to do with that Tonga eruption down there, wherever it was, Indonesia or somewhere. But anyway, you can look that up. Now the NOx catalyst is the one, the downstream oxygen sensor is watching. Okay, so this is the one that's crammed up there next to the manifold. You got a sensor here, you got a sensor down there. If you get a code for an for a catalytic converter, efficiency code, and the thing is, and you replace the downstream one for this because it's easier to replace, then you're replacing the wrong one and you're going to get the same code. I've seen this happen. The light off cat handles NOx and needs to get really, really hot, really, really fast. That's why I'm mounted so near the engine. I'll talk about that again just briefly in a minute. Now these are the things that can damage the catalytic converter. You can save this screen if you want to. I'm not going to talk about each and every one of them, but you can figure it out just looking at it. Anything that's going through there that's causing the catalytic converter to overheat or get contaminated or get coated with anything. People used to put leaded fuel in the cars that, they took lead out. Lead used to coat the valves and make, parts of the engine last longer in a combustion chamber area. Well, they took the lead out because it would coat the catalytic converter and ruin it. Well, some people boneheaded enough to keep putting leaded gas in there, and it would ruin the catalytic converter and clog it up with lead because it would get, caked up in there, in the honeycomb and on those metals. When the chemical reaction produces heat, it gets really hot. The gases going out of the converter ought to be hotter than the ones going into the converter, but a temperature gun, particularly if you're looking at one that is where the catalytic converter is right there on the manifold, that's not totally accurate, because what's coming in is going to be coming right out of the cylinders. It's going to be super hot, and you may wind up seeing it hotter coming right out of the cylinders than you do going out the back. If you got one that you can measure, and usually this will be down, closer to 200 degrees than that, but it can be really high depending on the temperature of everything. But if you got an inline one like that, it should be hotter back here than it is up here. If it's really hot up here but it's cool back here, suspect the catalytic converter. If the catalytic converter has changed colors, like it's gunmetal blue, then it's probably been hot several times, and you may be looking at an eventual problem there. Catalyst efficiency, though, is really important, and that's basically measuring oxygen storage capacity of the catalyst. And once again, the oxidation catalyst in the back is not measured for efficiency, but the NOx catalyst is. So you can do your manifold vacuum testing. That's one of the earliest ways that we did that. With the engine in neutral, we apply the throttle. If the vacuum drops and stays low, like you see on this gauge here, while you're holding the throttle, now there's an exhaust restriction. Whenever you do this, whenever you apply the throttle, this needle ought to bounce down and come right back up. If it goes down and stays down, you can get it to do this exactly the same thing if you put the engine, like say you brake torque it, put it in drive or reverse, and make sure you're not going to run over anything. And if you watch the vacuum while you're got it in drive and you apply the throttle, as long as the engine's loaded, this is going to go down and stay down. But having the catalytic converter completely, or partially clogged, is going to cause the vacuum to go down and stay down. The same, just like you had it in gear with it, but if it's not in gear, if it's in neutral, and you're giving it the gas and it goes down and stays down, like you just saw this little animation I created, then you need to be concerned about the way it's breathing. Now this is what clogged cats look like. I took these pictures myself in the shop. That vermiculite stuff, that blanket that's around the outside, sometimes will start to come apart, and parts of it will get in here, and it'll chunk up and all that. This is what a new catalyst looks like. As a matter of fact, if I remember right, this one and this one, I got it. This was on a, I think a 2004 Monte Carlo. That they wasn't running worth a flip, and you can see that thing is just about completely clogged. This honeycomb ought to, be completely unobstructed. Sometimes it breaks up, and I'll talk about that again too. Got a little bit of a knocker here. The knocker. We will get this changed out in 7 hours. By the end of the day, that engine over there will be in this car, and we will. It's pretty nasty stuff. Time for a motor. You gonna be able to make it happen?
Make it happen.
You're gonna make it happen. That guy right there is now a Ford senior master, and he works at a dealership down in Florida, and he's super sharp. But that catalytic converter picture you see right there, I went with a borescope through the oxygen sensor hole and took that picture, and that catalyst was on this car, and that catalyst was the reason that this car was knocking. If you got a knocking engine on something like an Altima, and you don't check that catalyst, you're subject to have that engine you put in there come back knocking. Now, we looked down in there and saw that this was coming apart, and what happens is those little rocks and stuff, little bits of stuff that comes from that clay honeycomb, rattles around and makes their way, because of your puffs in the exhaust pressure and all, some of it's going to rattle its way back up and get back up in the cylinders, and it just ruined things. The first time I ever heard about this kind of thing happening, some of it goes through the EGR system too, and gets in there. But the first time I heard about that was on these '89 Ford SHO. They had trouble with some of those, the catalytic converter coming apart and destroying the engine, and you know that's basically a disaster. But if you got particularly an Altima, because they like to do this, you got an Altima with a knocking engine, you better be looking at that catalytic converter or price one out as a part of your repair, because you're not going to hurt them. Usually from the parts store, a bolt-on catalytic converter for an Altima, the ones that I was buying back then were like $300 or something like that, $325. I can't remember the exact price, but it's always a good idea to replace that doggone thing in a situation where you think it may have caused that, and we knew for a fact this caused that one. So now you got a back pressure testing is the most accurate. You can buy a tool or you can make one like this, and this is what I did. Drilled a hole, cut the tip off of a brake bleeder, screwed it in there. I got me a back pressure tester. Take the oxygen sensor out, screw that in, put your plain old vacuum gauge on there just like you ordinarily would, and except you're going to need to use some silicone hose that's really high heat. If you use regular vacuum hose, this thing's going to get pretty doggone hot. So what you're going to do is put your hose on there, and I don't know how many times we've actually found one. It shouldn't have any back pressure at all. If it's got any back pressure, it's suspect. And I've seen as little as 5 psi back pressure cause a power problem that we didn't notice it so bad driving, but the guy said it didn't feel right to him. And whenever we pull the catalyst off of there after finding 5 psi of back pressure using this method, it was on a Trailblazer, and we looked in that catalytic converter and it was clogged up. And we got a Walker cat that was for that vehicle, and we had it, you know, basically what you got to do if you're going to weld another one in there, you better mark those pipes really good with a Sharpie or something, and you're basically going to have make marks where that you can put that other converter in there exactly the same way. And what we did was we put the we cut the existing cat out, and we put this other cat in there, and we tack welded it, and to make sure it would fit right. So we had all the lines up, tack welded it, bolted it back under there to make sure that all the pipes were lined up so that it would fit. Because if you don't, it's not going back on there. It's going to be crooked and out of line. You got to have that exactly right. And so what we did was, after we did that, I had one of the students carry it over the welding department, and they welded it up so that it looked like a factory weld job. Now we could weld exhaust, but we weren't that good at it. And the welding department, you know, had their fancy MIG machines and all that stuff that they could make it happen with. Well, muffler shop style, you drill a 1/8 hole in the pipe right here. Not there. I actually put that arrow in the wrong place. I was an idiot. But you can actually, if you're just checking this converter, that would be a good place to check. If you're checking that one and you can get to the pipe and it's not one that's crammed up against the head, you can check that there. But this one here, you're basically checking the one behind is what you're doing. 1/8 hole. Get this silicone hose to a regular old vacuum gauge, hold it up flat against that hole, and you're checking the back pressure to see what's building up in front of that. This one pegged the gauge, slapped it all the way around there, and it would almost, I was worried that it might have messed up that little burden tube gear in there, but anyway, we had a lot of back pressure on that. All right, so this one had a gutted cat. And these numbers are not as incredibly ugly as you think they might be, because this was actually the numbers that we got from this cat that was gutted. We had 13.7% CO2, 27% CO, and we didn't have any oxygen there, and no hydrocarbons, but we had 90 parts per million of that. And this was what your lambda looks like. Your lambda 1.0 is perfect. And the number that goes either way is not. Anyway, there's your 14.3. All these numbers were 0, and this was a perfect. See how it changed that. Of course, he had codes and that kind of thing, and that's one of the reasons. This Jeep here belonged to a doctor, and he basically wanted it fixed back the way it was supposed to be, so the check engine light would go away and all that. Now this is that same Jeep. This is what the scan tool looked like. See, 1.1 and 1.2. 2.1 and 2.2. See how they were all switching together? I mean, that was almost practically a mirror, and that's one of the ways you can tell the catalytic converter efficiency is gone. Now, you're not going to find a clogged cat this way, but you will find one that's been gutted this way. And this is what it looked like after we put new cats on it. And the doctor, he was willing to pay for new cats because he wanted it back like it was supposed to be. This one here was still active, this one was flat. This one was active, that one was flat. That's what you're looking for. And this was my Explorer, which I recently sold to my son. I bought a new 2025 Ranger. But this, this is basically the one behind the catalyst number 2. Bank 1 is going to be where cylinder number 1 is. Bank 2 is going to be where cylinder number 2 is. So this is the one on the oxygen sensor in front of the one on the right bank, which would be the passenger side bank on that Explorer. This is the one behind the one on the left bank. I don't know why I had that set up that way with that torque app. This gives you the catalyst temperature in Celsius, which comes out to about 1300 degrees or whatever. But anyway, I had EGR flow up there and evaporative and so on. Anyway, so there you go. That was what that was supposed to look like, and I was constantly monitoring that. That radio that I had it was an Android radio. I could put apps on, and I could actually look at stuff, have this stuff going down the road and watch it in real time if I so desired. All right, with a gas analyzer, you can test one, and this is going to be something you probably hadn't seen before. A good catalytic converter should be capable of converting hydrocarbon that's pumped through it to 12% carbon dioxide, which would be numbers that would look like this on your exhaust gas analyzer. Most people aren't going to have an exhaust gas analyzer because it costs about $5,000. But all right, so perform the test. You got to have it fully warmed up, drive it, and run it at 2,000 RPM to heat the converter. You got to have your, immediately have your exhaust, exhaust is warmed up, and your analyzer, you got to put it in there just as soon as you switch it off. Disable the ignition. Don't use clear flood because you want it to squirt fuel in there. Disable the ignition, disconnect the coil or ground the secondary. Fuel system's got to be active. Crank the engine with the starter. Immediately after shutdown, monitor the exhaust gases. And it should be able to, you should see something like this. See, and that's what you're looking for. And that'll give you an idea right then if the converter is capable of doing its conversion. Now, this is your diesel NOx cat monitor. It's a diagram that I put together for this. And you might be, I did this for carparts.com for some stuff I was reviewing for them. I put this, created this anyway, I cobbled it together from some other images, but the long and the short of it is you won't find this anywhere online exactly like this unless you see it from on carparts.com, where I created it and put it on there if you used it. Anyway, there's, you got that tank. They're worried about this freezing, see, so they got a fluid quality sensor, you got a tank heater, you got this line, they got heating it up on the way, and that's the dosing injector that makes the NOx catalyst work and that kind of thing. You got upstream NOx sensor, downstream NOx sensor. See, these are not just oxygen sensors, they're NOx sensors. And they got a little module that's made as part of each sensor and all that. Thought you might find that interesting. Well, this 86 LTD, I bought this thing used from a guy that worked at a parts store. And it was really nice at the time, and this was 20 years ago, or 25 years ago. And I bought it for $550 from a guy that worked at a parts store. He had replaced all kinds of parts that he got at the parts store to no avail. And this thing had that little, throttle body injection on it and all that. And he worked and worked and worked on it. His wife said, if we could even get $500 for it, we'd be happy. And I said, well, I'll give you $550 for it, So brought it home. And I found out this catalytic converter, which was a bolt-on unit, real easy to change, was clogged up. And so that's all that one needed to take care of that. Pop that converter on it. And basically, did I put a used one on there or what? I can't remember. It's 25 years ago. But anyway, one way or another, I got it straightened out where it would run real good. Put a different radio in it that I had on hand and, wired it up and all that. And this guy at the college wanted to buy the car from me because I told him it was for sale for $800, I think it was, or something. And I didn't want to make a lot of money off of it. I just wanted to move the car. It didn't really get that good of gas mileage. It had a V6 with that C5 transmission in it and all that. and a no lockup converter, so it really didn't get good fuel economy at all. So anyway, he says he kept trying to Jew me down. I said, no, I'm not that hot to trot to sell it. And so finally he came up to my price and he bought it. Said, I've never come up to anybody's price in my life, but I'm going to buy this car from you. So he bought it, and he drove it for a little while, and he sold it. And I said, what'd you get for it? He was scared to tell me. I said, I'm not going to get mad no matter what you got for it. He sold that car for $1,800. And I said, well, I'm glad you made money off of it, but he was scared that if I found out that he had made as much off of it as he did, that I would be mad at him. But I wasn't mad at him because I got what I wanted for it, you see. And this other one was totally unusual. Before the days of catalytic converters, when I had never seen a stopped up exhaust before. And I'm telling you, this was like in, this one was built before catalytic converters. Now, there were catalytic converters out there when this happened. I was going through the oil refinery on the way down to the place where I worked, down at the shop where I was doing fleet maintenance. And I bounced over a railroad track, and I said, all right, now that I'm out of the oil refinery, I'm going to go ahead and hammer down on this thing. And it had a 400 in it. Now I hit the gas really hard, and all of a sudden, this thing's making hissing sounds. It's lost almost all of its power. I can't go over 40 miles an hour. And I was like, what in the world? I don't even remember why I was going down to the plant, but this was at night. And so I got in there in the shop, and I raised this thing up on jack stands. Well, basically before I raised it up, I noticed that when I took the breather off and I'd rev it up, gas would come up out of the carburetor and hit me on the hand. And I was scratching my head about that, and finally I said, this thing has got to be having trouble breathing. And once again, I had never seen this before, even on cars with catalytic converters at the time, because this was back in the early days. And so I raised that thing up, and I noticed that these pipes right here, and this is what that car looked like underneath, were kind of skint and flat looking on the bottom, like they had been drug across the pavement and went across railroad tracks and all, because the suspension on these cars tends to get weak, and they sit a little lower than they should. And so I said, well, I wonder if there's something going on there. And so I got a hacksaw and I cut this pipe, and what I found, well, both pipes actually had done this at the same time. That laminated pipe, and this is vaguely what it looked like, had blown loose on the inside. It was round on the outside except for having these little flat skint spots, and it blew up on the inside and clogged the exhaust. And it happened all at once. When I gave it a lot of gas, all that exhaust going through there blew that inside laminate loose and just closed up the pipe. We had some scrap pipe on hand down there, and I got under that thing and bolted these pipes back up, propped this one up like it was supposed to be, cut a couple of pipes that were exactly the right length, and put them in place, just got them up in there, and I tacked them, tack welded them, with a torch on both sides, just so that I'd make darn sure that I had this configured right. Because even back then, I was smart enough to know that if you just lay this on the floor and you weld a piece of pipe in there, it ain't gonna fit right going back up in there. You got to be smart enough to see that going in. And after I replaced it, both sides, I replaced these sections of pipe that had, that had flattened out on the bottom, and the laminate had blown you loose on the inside. And that car ran like brand new after that. But anyway, that was not a catalytic converter rated story, but it was a clogged exhaust story. The muffler can do that too if something happens on there. But anyway, that's the end of this one. We've been here 23 minutes. I hope you made it through. And let me know what you think about this, and I'll talk to you guys next week.